Hey, what's up everybody? This is David Drinks here at the Med Gym, and thanks for coming back for another Technique Tuesday. It's been a few weeks since I've been able to film one of these Technique Tuesday videos, but I'm excited to be back with you today and better than ever with a new microphone setup, so hopefully the sound quality is pretty good in this video. And this week we're going to talk about one big technique flaw that I see with a lot of mobility drills that we do here at the Med Gym. So the technique flaw is really in the setup as well as the execution of that mobility drill, where most people when they are going through it aren't mobilizing the correct area of the body, or they're at least not maximizing the effect of that mobility drill because they're either setting up for it properly or they're moving through the drill improperly. And what happens when you do that, like I said, not only is it minimize the effectiveness of that drill, but you could potentially even cause more harm than good if you're mobilizing the wrong segments of the body, the wrong joints. So we want to show you how to set up properly as well as how to go through mobility drills with proper technique and a few key things to watch out for as you're going through these mobility drills. So one of the first things you need to know when setting up for and performing a mobility drill is what part of the body you're trying to mobilize and also what part of the body you're not trying to mobilize or you should stay away from mobilizing. And the human body works in kind of a joint by joint approach in general. And what that means is that there's certain joints that tend towards needing mobility and there's certain joints that tend towards needing more stiffness. And this is a bit of a general approach, but it rings true for most people. And so to walk you through a couple of those, the ankle joint tends to need more mobility to function properly, while the knee joint tends to need a little more stability. It's not supposed to be super mobile. Going up from there, the hip joint should have lots of mobility. It should be able to move in all planes of motion. And the lumbar spine up from there, the low back, should be mostly stable. It's not really, it's bigger vertebrae. They're not really meant to move a lot, twisting and lateral flexion and whatnot. And then up from there, the thoracic spine, the upper back, has a ton more freedom of mobility compared to the low back. And so you can kind of go up the chain in the body and determine which joints we should be focusing on mobilizing and what joints we should be focused on providing stability to and staying away from too much mobility. So once you know what part of the body you're trying to mobilize, the next key is to be able to focus in on how to mobilize that part of the body and not mobilize a part of the body next to it that we're trying to stay away from. So I'm going to go over a few different mobility drills and a few different parts of the body that we want to focus on having mobility at and how to avoid doing these mobility drills the wrong way. So the first one we're going to do is focused on the thoracic spine and more specifically thoracic spine extension. So as I mentioned, a lot of people have more stiffness in the thoracic spine. They tend to be a little bit more rolled over, whether that's because they sit at a desk a lot, they text a lot, or any other number of reasons. And so a great mobility drill to do is to extend the thoracic spine. And I like to do this using a foam roller. And so to set up for this, we'll place the foam roller right below the shoulder blades or kind of in that general area, the middle of the upper back. And so the thoracic spine is 12 vertebrae long. You got a little bit of room to play with, but usually right about that spot right below the shoulder blades is a good starting point. So the key in not doing this improperly in mobilizing either the cervical spine or the lumbar spine is making sure that you're focusing in on the upper back and the thoracic spine, and that's what we want to extend with. So a couple of technique flaws that we see is people going back into this and hyperextending the neck, or they don't have good core stability and they lay back and let their low back arch as well. So to avoid those mistakes, to avoid mobilizing the lumbar spine or the cervical spine, we want to brace through the core, use the hands to support the head, and have controlled extension over the roller with that thoracic spine. So the next mobility drill that we have a lot of technique flaws on is sticking with the thoracic spine and looking at thoracic spine rotation. So the other quality that tends to get lost for a lot of people other than thoracic spine extension is the ability to rotate. And when that gets lost, it kind of goes along with the stiffness of the rolling forward and not having a lot of upper back mobility. But when that gets lost, a lot of times people tend to then overuse the cervical spine in rotation or the lumbar spine in rotation, and they overuse and abuse those areas of the body and don't mobilize and move through the thoracic spine. So we'd like to train thoracic rotation as well as thoracic extension, but the key on this one and to avoid the technique flaw that we're going to talk about is making sure that you set up properly so you don't end up rotating through the lumbar spine too much. And so we're going to set up a side-lying thoracic rotation, and I'm going to use a roller to help support the lumbar spine. So when I set up for this one, I got the top leg propped up on a roller at 90 degrees. And so one of the biggest technique flaws is people will set up for this and they'll either have nothing under their knees, so they're kind of rolled forward and their lumbar spine is twisted, or they'll set up too low with the roller. And so that effectively doesn't lock the lumbar spine in place versus being up here in a 90-degree angle at the hip, locks the pelvis and the lumbar spine in place. And so you're not going to rotate through that. You're going to rotate more through the thoracic spine. And so one leg flexed, get it up to 90 degrees, the other leg extend it, and we're just going to do a side-lying rotation, not even worrying about the arms, but just doing a rib grab. So I grab the rib cage, lay the head back, and rotate through the upper back. So I'm monitoring that this knee is staying put. I'm not letting it come up and twist with me. So I'm isolating, the lumbar spine is locked in place, and rotating right through the upper back. So that thoracic spine mobility that we just talked about on the ground is a huge key for a lot of people in making sure that you're getting mobility from the right spot. You're not overusing the lumbar spine, the low back, or the cervical spine when you're going through everyday life movements or when you're doing that mobility drill in the gym. So setting up for it and going through those drills properly is key. And the third one we're going to talk about is now moving up from the thoracic spine to the shoulder. And so we're going to talk a little bit about good shoulder overhead mobility. So a lot of people, and it goes along with the kind of rolled forward posture again, they lack the ability to get the arms overhead and to access pure shoulder range of motion. And so a lot of times, whether it's they're starting from a rolled forward posture, they can only get to here, or they tend to get overhead, but they compensate. So they go extending through the low back, the lumbar spine, instead of being able to isolate the shoulder motion. So we want to be sure that when we're setting up for overhead mobility drills with the shoulder in order to work on that range of motion, that we're locking in the core. We're not hyperextending the low back, but we're isolating true shoulder flexion as you go overhead. So one great way to do that is called a back to wall shoulder flexion. So if I set up against the wall here, I'm able to use the wall as feedback, that I'm rounding or flattening the low back into the wall, so tipping the pelvis backwards. And you're going to start here with the head back against the wall, the low back against the wall, and you're just going to maintain that contact with the wall as you go straight overhead. So that allows me to ensure that I'm not hyperextending here, I'm not shooting the head forward to get more shoulder mobility or false shoulder mobility. I'm actually getting true shoulder mobility. So really important to be able to get overhead with the arms, but making sure that you can do it without throwing the low back under the bus or shooting the head forward. So those first three exercises that we talked about, the thoracic spine extension, the thoracic spine rotation, and the overhead shoulder mobility, are all three that I tend to see a lot of those technique flaws on that I talked about. However, there's one more aspect of mobility that I want to talk about today. Really the reason that I started this video, because I see this technique flaw probably more than any other, and that's with most hip mobility drills that we do. So let's take a second and talk about hip mobility and how to do it properly. So, hip mobility. One of the biggest technique flaws that I see when it comes to mobility drills is when we do most hip mobility drills. And for a lot of people, it's almost like their lumbar spine is stuck attached to their hips. So they can't move their hips without rotating through their lumbar spine. And so we want to talk about how we can do a hip mobility drill while not compromising the lumbar spine, the low back. You got to be able to mobilize your hips without mobilizing your low back. To give you an idea of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about hip mobility and compromising the low back, we see a lot of this happen when I do a basic hip rocking drill with people. And I like to refer to it as dissociating the hip from the spine, meaning that you should be able to move your hip independently of your low back. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, I'm going to do a hip rocking drill. I call this hips flexed, hip rocking. So one hip flexed, one leg straight back, and we're just going to do a side-to-side rock. So I'm rocking into some adduction at the hip, so we're getting some stretch on the outside of it, and then back out into abduction at the hip. And so we're just going side-to-side rocking and working on some of that side-to-side mobility of the hip joint itself. The problem though, most people when they get into this, they tend to rock and start twisting the low back. So they'll twist this way, they'll twist back this way, and it becomes more of a hinge drill at the low back rather than at the hip. So what we want to do to avoid that is, instead of twisting and rocking, think about the whole upper body locked in place, and you're just rocking side to side, pressing that hip bone out towards the wall next to you, and then coming back. So we see a lot of low back compensation when we get that side-to-side rocking drill. Instead of isolating the hip joint and going through abduction, adduction at the hip joint itself, we're starting to just twist the lumbar spine and twist the low back. So you want to avoid that. And then another drill that we see with hip mobility that the low back tends to get too much motion at is a adductor rock back. So you can do this in a couple different ways. You could do it with both knees down and just going with a straight rock back, mobilizing the inner thigh, or you could do a split stance rock back with one leg straight out to the side. So either way, one of the biggest technique flaws that I see with this is, as people start going back, they either lose hip mobility or they just lose awareness of where they're at with their back, and they start rolling through the spine. So now I'm not mobilizing my hip as much as I'm mobilizing my low back. So in order to fix that, we want to stick the butt out to the wall behind you, maintain that the whole time as you sit back and as you go forward. So the back is perfectly level. Now I'm not mobilizing my spine, I'm mobilizing where I should be, the inner thigh and the hip joint. So coming back to the main point of this video, I really wanted to film something that was talking about isolating your hip mobility, your upper back mobility, your shoulder mobility, all of those mobility drills where we're trying to get the right kind of movement at the right joints and making sure that we're not compensating and losing the effectiveness of the mobility drill, and also compromising other parts of the body that should not be getting too much mobility. So what happens when we take a exercise like those hip mobility drills I just showed you, and we start rolling through the lumbar spine, is not only are we not mobilizing our hip, but we're re-ingraining a poor movement pattern where instead of moving through your hips, you're moving through your low back, which just adds on more mobility at a joint and a series of joints in the lumbar spine that should be stable. Same thing with the other mobility drills we talked about, and a number of other examples that we didn't get into today. So make sure as you're going through your mobility drills that you're aware of how you're setting up for them, what you're supposed to be mobilizing, and then how you're doing it. And so make sure you're not throwing the other parts of the body under the bus as you work on your mobility.